Welcome back, everybody, to Channel Enright with another discussion on American history today. A few things we want to talk about today that are about how America deals with the war at home. Now, I want to remind you that when we look at wars, we're not as focused on the military strategies and the battles and the generals and the heroes. They're important, but wars are huge events. And so we look at the causes of the war, the effects of the war, and the way they impact the average person. Right. So today we're going to look at the way this war, World War II, remember that's with the Roman numeral, 2 I's. A lot of you still get that wrong. World War II impacts the average American in a variety of different aspects. Let's back up a little bit and talk about the war as a whole. This is a war that's going on globally, and it's going on in 2 different places. Right? It's going on in Asia, in the Pacific in particular, where the United States is fighting the Japanese, and it's going on in Europe, where the United States is fighting the Nazis and the Italians, the Germans and the Italians. Those distinct areas of the war are referred to as theaters of operation. There's the European theater of operation and the Pacific theater of operation, which Americans abbreviated as the ETO and the PTO. In any theater of operation, there are different fronts. In the European theater of operation, there was the African front, the Eastern front, eventually after D-Day, the Western front. Right? So when people talked about the war, they talked about what was going on different fronts. And the soldiers were fighting on this front, and my son Johnny's on the Italian front, etc. But most people were too young, too old, too female to be in the Army or the Navy. They had to help the war effort in some other way. So people referred to the effort of average individuals as fighting on the home front. Right? So the home front was a lot of different things. And I want to point out a few that they just, kids could even participate in. The Army was trying to make sure that they had enough metal to make the tanks and guns and bullets. You could get that by mining metal in Wisconsin and Minnesota, where there are huge iron ore deposits, but that meant taking men who would might be used for the Army and putting them into those mines. It was a lot better to gather together old bits of metal that weren't being used anymore and melt them down to make those tanks and ships and etc. So scrap metal drives become a major concern for kids. They would go around the neighborhood and knock on people's doors and ask if they had any, old roller skates and bicycles and, tires that could be converted for military use, and they would collect them all up, and the government would collect those things. Women stopped wearing nylon hose because nylon was important to the war effort for making parachutes. People planted gardens. Now, we talked about this a little bit with World War I. But World War II is where they really get the name Victory Gardens, and most Americans are planting something. Remember, we need to increase food production, not just for ourselves, but to help the Allies. And so farmers, just like in World War I, are being encouraged to plant more and use new equipment. But this time the government's helping them out with low interest loans, so they're not going to banks and going deeper into debt, as well as grants to help that. But most people started planting gardens. They tore up their backyard. Some people tore up their front yard. If they lived in apartments, they would plant tomatoes in their window boxes instead of flowers. People did what they could. They planted victory gardens and increased food production on a micro scale, but when everybody does it, it has a huge impact. People helped pay for the war, just like in World War I, by buying bonds. In World War I, we called them Liberty bonds. In World War II, they're just called war bonds, but there's a huge push to get people to buy war bonds and help support the war effort. Another thing that the average person could do, Joe Schmo, who wasn't going off to fight, who was past the age of joining the Army or too young or for whatever reason couldn't be in the Army, was to work in a munitions factory. Now, this was important because this is a war that's going to be won as much by the people working in the factories as it is by the people on the battlefield. Production was incredibly important to this war effort. And the government does a huge number of things to try and increase that production. For example, the Braceros program that brought Mexican Americans north into California to work in the munitions factories. Also encouraging African Americans from the South to move off those sharecropping farms into the northern cities where they could work in the factories and earn a better living. We'll get back to that one in just a second. But that's part of that great migration that started with World War I as blacks move out of the rural South into the urban North. We call that the Great Migration. At first, when African Americans came up to get those factory jobs, many found that despite the desperate need for their labor, factories refused to pay blacks an equal amount to whites. If it was a factory that was making munitions or something for the army, they were under a government contract. And so you read about this already, but Philip Randolph, your book lists him as A. Philip Randolph. He went by Philip. Philip Randolph was the head of an African-American labor union. Now, there are not a lot of these. You got to remember, most of the labor unions are trade unions. They're just beginning to have big industrial unions. And trade unions excluded blacks by excluding blacks from the trades. And so there were very few blacks in labor unions in America. The only labor union that had ever regularly accepted blacks was the old Knights of Labor, and they went under after the Haymarket Riot back in the 1870s. So there's not been a lot of blacks in labor unions. But Philip Randolph headed the Pullman Porters Union, the American Federation of Pullman Porters. And the Pullman Porters Union, and I'm not making this up, was a union of 10,000 black men, all named George. Not kidding. Because Pullman porters, the people who carried your luggage onto a train, remember the Pullman cars we talked about earlier this year, the sleeping cars, they were first-class travel. And if you were traveling in a Pullman car, you expected your bags to be carried. Well, Pullman porters, the people who lugged your suitcases onto the train, all went by the name George. You wouldn't say, excuse me, sir, could you, carry these to my compartment? You would say, George, come here. They were always black men. They're named after George Pullman, the guy who invented the Pullman car, but they went by George all the time. And so Philip Randolph heads up this union of 10,000 men, but he is a huge figure in the black community. And he threatens the government. He says he will bring 1 million African American men to Washington, D.C. to march on Washington and demand equal pay. Now, he never does that because the very threat of tens of thousands of black men marching on Washington, D.C. was enough to get President Roosevelt to sit down and write an executive order that made it illegal for anybody getting a government contract to pay blacks less than they were paying whites. And so for most of the war, those blacks who moved north for the factory jobs got paid the same that whites did. And they were getting paid a decent wage, more than whites had been paid beforehand, because they were desperate for these parts, and the idea of having anybody go on strike would have just ruined production. Remember, production's incredibly important. All right. Toward that end, the vast majority, or a huge portion of the young men in America have gone off to fight the war. The factories are opening up for the first time since the Great Depression. We're at almost full factory capacity. If it's a factory, it's working. And there just aren't enough people for all the jobs needed. We need to make literally billions of bullets, millions of guns, uniforms, tanks, cannon, planes, ships. And so the government turns to an untapped workforce. They did this in World War I as well, but not nearly to this extent. They tapped into women. Women became the factory workers. And just like the blacks, they were getting the same pay that the men were in order to entice them into those factories. Back in World War I, the government encouraged factories to pay women more, but most of them didn't. So, literally for the first time in American history, women are getting equal pay for doing the same job. It's never happened before. Now, those women, we call them Rosies, because of an illustration drawn by a famous American illustrator, Norman Rockwell. I put a copy of it on my stream the other day, where a woman is eating her lunch out of a lunchbox that says Rosie, and she has a great big rivet gun across her lap. She's been working in a shipyard, riveting sheet metal together. Rosie the Riveter becomes this icon in American history, and she may well, I can't overstate how important Rosie is. She may be a fictional character, but she's probably the most important woman in American history. She changes everything, because for the entire time that we're at war, women in America are earning a man's paycheck, and they're making the decisions about what's going to happen with that paycheck. They're deciding what gets bought for their families. They're budgeting for their families. They're in charge. Right? And when the men get back and all those women lose those jobs, that independence that they gained as being Rosies is hard to give up. Quite literally, the beginning of the women's movement starts with Rosie the Riveter. The idea that women are the equals of men and should be considered the equals of men begins with Rosie the Riveter. As a national idea. There were individuals who believed it before that, but as a national idea, it starts with Rosie. Now, after the war, many women were quite happy going back to their traditional roles, but a lot weren't. And so Rosie changes things, and she changes things in huge ways, not just helping America win the war, but helping create the America we have today. I want to talk briefly, when we're talking about home front organizations, about the draft itself, the selective service system. We were going over this with World War I, how millions of people had to be selected, and a selection process had to be created. Every time the United States has had a draft, it's been different. But every time there's been a draft, there have been ways that some people could get out of the draft. If you had enough money, if you had enough connections, if you had enough education, you could avoid going to fight. It has literally been the case in every single time the United States has had a draft. In World War II, there was no exception. People with connections could be deemed important for other reasons. They had a skill that was needed, whatever the rationale was. But most people who got that draft notice wanted to go. Right? The propaganda campaign to get people to join the army or go when drafted is not nearly as intense as it was in World War I. In World War I, we had to convince America that this was the right idea. For World War II, because of Pearl Harbor and because of fascism, this is an easy sell. Most Americans believed that this was the right idea. Most Americans wanted to contribute in some way. They did by the end of World War I, but they did at the beginning of World War II, the beginning of our role in World War II. I want to speak a little bit. Your book talks about women in the military, and there's an important thing going on here. When the Army created the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, the WACs, the Navy had a similar thing called the Waves, which isn't mentioned in your textbook, but they put women in uniform. Now, women had helped in the military before. They had had jobs working for the Army, the Navy, as secretaries, telephone operators, nurses, etc. But they had never been officially part of the Army. The WACs and the Waves, women got military rank, which meant they got military pensions. For the first time in American history, women were in the Army. And this opens the door to women being in the Army as they are today in combat roles and in high-ranking positions in the Army. Never would have happened before World War II. Now, the reason, the idea behind the WACs and the WAVES was not to put women in combat. It wasn't to have female soldiers. It was to have women doing roles that men had been doing up to that point. Clerical jobs, filing, carrying stretchers, doing a variety of different things. But by putting women in those roles, you could free up the men to go fight. So the creation of the WACs and the WAVES brought women into the military, officially into the military for the first time. Now, your book talks about the WASPs, the Women's Air Specialty Pilots, the WASPs, who ferried troops back and forth and cargo around the United States and between combat zones occasionally. Interesting thing about the WASPs, as well as a group of women who trained pilots how to fly. They were pilots themselves and were trainers for the Army so that they could free up pilots to fight. They were not part of the military. And when the war was over, they didn't get military pensions or military recognition. They didn't get the veterans benefits that the women in the WACs and the WAVES got, as much as they did for the military. This goes for nurses in the Army as well. They were not officially in the Army. They worked for the Army, but they weren't a member of the Army. Okay, this brings us to the one last thing I really wanted to talk about today, and it is Executive Order 9066. Executive Order 9066 is one of the dark spots of American history. President Roosevelt, under pressure from a lot of Americans, especially on the West Coast, issued this order a few weeks after Pearl Harbor. With Executive Order 9066, anybody in the United States who was of Japanese descent was ordered to show up with one suitcase full of stuff, and they were brought to remote locations in the desert in Arizona and the mountains in Wyoming, and put into camps with armed guards. Taking one group of people that you fear might be a political threat and putting them into prison together is known as creating a concentration camp. Now, your book shies away from using that word, but the internment camps or relocation camps, are the words that the government used, are nothing short of concentration camps. That's what the word means. Now, these are not Nazi death camps. Let's not confuse them with that. When people think of the word concentration camp, they think of the death camps that the Nazis had, whose purpose was to kill people. Very few people died because they were in the camps. There were a few. The people who got too close to the wire and an overzealous guard shot them, or a couple of instances where people tried to leave the camps. People within those camps were allowed to go to school, plant gardens, have clubs, play games. They lived as families, but the conditions were close. Families were living together in very tight quarters. There wasn't a lot of privacy, and this was prison. It was prison. You couldn't leave. You were under armed guard. They had to give up everything. They had to sell everything they owned in just a few days, which meant that their neighbors were buying up houses and businesses and cars at a fraction of what they were worth. They had to sell everything they owned and go to these camps, and many of them were there for the entirety of the war. Not all of them. The rules changed over time, but many of them stayed in those camps for the whole war. It's important to note that this did not happen to German Americans, and this did not happen to Italian Americans. It only happened to Japanese Americans. Now, part of that is because of Pearl Harbor and the incredible anger surrounding Pearl Harbor, the Americans who died. But part of that is anti-Asian racism. The Italians and Germans are Europeans. America is a European culture, and as we've seen in earlier units, there was a tremendous racism toward against Asian cultures. So I'm not going to lump it all on that, but it's one of the factors involved in why this group is isolated, is separated, is considered a danger. Even people who were born in the United States. Now, let's go back, guys. Remember, if you're born in the United States, that makes you what? Exactly. An American citizen. So we're taking American citizens and throwing them in jail without any charge. Now, not all of them were American citizens. There's Issei and Nisei and these different breakdowns, but a good portion of the people thrown in those jails were American citizens. Remember, it's the 14th Amendment says if you're born on U.S. soil, you're a U.S. citizen. And so by putting these people in these internment camps, you're taking citizens of your own country and without a charge, throwing them in jail and leaving them there. Now, the Supreme Court upheld the right of the government to do this, but in later years, looking back on it, the government of the United States has admitted that it was in error, has offered apologies to the Japanese American community, and even under President Bush offered reparations to the Japanese Americans in the form of cash payments. It was I don't remember the number, something like $4,000 for each person who spent time in the camps, which many Japanese Americans thought of as almost an insult, considering what they gave up. Their businesses, their homes, their reputations, their lives were put on hold for the whole war. So the Japanese internment camps are seen by most historians and many Americans as an embarrassing moment in American history. Now that doesn't mean that Roosevelt did something horrible. He did something that the American people wanted. Most people were afraid. Pearl Harbor had scared people. And so he was bowing to popular support by creating these camps. We look back on it now and we can see it as something wrong. At the time, most Americans believed he was doing the right thing. Not all. There were people who argued against it, but most Americans believed he was doing the right thing, and he bowed to the pressure to do this. His own wife argued with him that this was a wrong move. I don't see anything else on my list. These are the main points about the home front that I didn't think were covered well enough in the textbook, and that I thought you needed a little bit more on. Remember, if you watch this, you don't have to join me for a Zoom class tomorrow. Well, by the time I post this, it'll be today. This will be Thursday. Hopefully, this was helpful. Let me know if there's anything you're still confused about. Contact me, email me, send me a note. I can set up a personal Zoom meeting if you want, or talk to you via notes or emails. Thanks a lot, and we'll talk soon.